Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the seminar on NIST 800-171 and CMMC assessment planning and documentation discussion and Q&A. We do want this to be open discussion, so go through a couple of housekeeping things here. You should have a panel on your screen that helps you to modify and adjust your audio, microphone, and headset capabilities. You also have a place to ask questions. So if, as we're going through, you have a question and want to type that in, you can do that. You can also use the raise hand function and we'll unmute you. There is a section here where we will have a Q&A session. I'll try it if I can navigate the control panel here. I'll try to unmute everyone and just let you ask questions during that time as well. But feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you and have a discussion about what we're talking about or what your question is. There's also a section for handouts. It's these slides, which do have some links in them, so I encourage you to download those. If you have a problem with the download, just email me. I think my name and email address shows up in a lot of the communication about the webinar. I don't know if I even said my name. My name's Brian Tucker. So it should show up in and you can, and it's also in here as well. But feel free to email me and we can get you the slides if you do have a problem with downloading. There's also some flyers on the Access program as well. So again, welcome. As I said, my name is Brian Tucker. I'm with the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Our office is the Office for Operational Excellence, and we manage the Alabama Cybersecurity Coaching and Education and Support Services Grant. It's a program that we're able to provide lower cost assistance and education training. It's a program from the DoD Office of Local Defense Community and Cooperation. So their mission is to support the industrial base and the communities around those companies that support the DoD or bases that support the DoD. And part of their mission is to make sure we have a resilient defense industrial base, which is made up of companies like that you guys work for. So we appreciate your commitment to our community, the part you play in our community, also the part you play in our DoD mission in supporting the warfighter. Also on with us today is Dr. Eric Emsan. He's from the UAH Information Technology and Systems Center. Our office manages the program, but the brains of the program is Eric and his team over in ITSC as it relates to cybersecurity. So we've got several partners. You might have heard of us from SBDC or PTAC or the Alabama Technology Network, and just want to acknowledge them as well. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into it. I'll share a little bit, then Eric will come on. But this topic is a little bit different. We're going to talk about a little bit more detail in the documentation side of things as it relates to NIST 800-171 and CMMC. And if we're gonna make the assumption that you know what these things are. There is a lot of information in the backup of these slides that we've had in previous webinars or seminars before. We're not going to go through those, but like I said, when you download the slides, you'll have those. We can certainly answer more questions about some of the stuff we may be glossing over. But you can also access previous webinar recordings. So that over to the right of this screen is the link to our previous webinar recordings. But today we're going to talk about an update on CMMC 2.0, CUI safeguarding as it relates to NIST 800-171 and CMMC 2.0. We'll go through what we understand these assessments are going to be like for companies that are pursuing CMMC level 2. And then we get into the documentation required, system security plan, action plans, documentation that you'll need. And then I'll share a little bit more about technical assistance through the Access program. We'll have some opportunity for Q&A, and then, like I said, there's a lot of information in the backup. So one of the things that the CMMC AB is doing is having monthly town halls, and so we're attending those, trying to glean as much information as we can, and want to share what we know related to some of the changes to CMMC 2.0, but also some things that have changed since it was first released. So first of all, the rulemaking when CMMC 2.0 was released in November 4th of 2021, they mentioned that the rulemaking would be out 9 to 24 months. So we're still in that window, and that's still being processed. Some people have taken that because the rulemaking process is still ongoing, that CMMC is on hold or not valid or something. But obviously the rulemaking is taking time. It's still a future requirement, and it always has been a future requirement. It's never been on official RFPs. There were some pilots that were being worked through before with the previous version. But the up in the top right corner, the recommendation is to continue to enhance your cybersecurity posture during this period. There will be an opportunity for companies to volunteer assess. So even before these DFARS clauses that will require CMMC start showing up on RFPs, you will have the opportunity to volunteer for an assessment. That's probably not going to be available until later in the summer. But there is a window of time that they're looking for people to volunteer assess so that they can help kind of people can get more up to speed even before the DFARS clauses show up on RFPs. So one of the changes that came with CMMC was they removed what they called the maturity requirements, which was a driver for a lot of documentation. And while those maturity requirements were dropped, they've made it clear that documentation will still be required. There's a lot of practices that say identify and define and log or record. So some of that is technical. Some of that you'll have a technical log or a technical list in like Active Directory, for example, or something like that. But a lot of it you will have to rely on documentation to be able to show evidence that you've got this practice in place. And also you'll need documentation just to run the business of securing your network. And so we're going to talk a lot about that today. Another change, I guess, is when in November, when 2.0 was rolled out, there was a statement that was made that some level 2 companies, if based on the level or the information that they had of how sensitive that CUI information is they may be able to self-assess or provide a self-attestation or a self-assessment and a score that they're meeting CMMC level 2. It seems that they're walking that back a little bit and are admitting that that's going to be infrequently applied. So what a lot of people may have been excited about, that a good many of level 2 companies may not have to have a certified third-party assessor, it looks like most of them will still need to have a certified third-party assessor. And I'll ask Eric to chime in here. He's been following this too, but on any of this stuff, Eric, if you have anything to add, let me know.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add, if only because I was on a national webinar just yesterday afternoon, and someone made the statement that, oh, well, you don't have to do anything for CMMC right now. You know, you have to do something for NIST 800-171, but you don't need to worry about CMMC. To echo what Brian's saying, those kinds of comments are out in the marketplace. The one thing I would say is, keep in mind, when you need that level 2 assessment, you're going to be paying an outside company to come in and do it. And that outside company is going to be, you know, the terms of the contract will of course be up between you and them. But if you're not ready, if they have to come back, if they have to do a whole nother assessment, these are things that are going to drive up your bill. So is there going to be a requirement for you to be CMMC certified in order to have a contract in the next however many months? Probably not. But I just, to echo what Brian is saying, I would not, CMMC is not on hold. It has slowed down a little bit, but it is not on hold.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And we'll actually, the next slide is what you need to be doing now. We'll talk more about that. But one of the rumors that was going around was that CMMC would be retroactive, meaning as soon as the rule came out, it would apply to current contracts. And that's what we're hearing, is that's not true. It'll only be incorporated into new or recompeted procurements, and that'll be made clear with the rulemaking. But So when they come out with whatever clauses there are, those are going to show up on new RFPs or recompetes. And just like we said, just the better position you can be in to when that happens, the further along you'll be, and also further along you'll be when you get your ready for your third party assessor and hopefully reduce your costs. So that's what we have on an update. Eric's going to talk a little bit about some of the specific changes to the model. But one of the things I will say, and just because we talked about CMMC 2.0 and NIST 800-171, one of those changes is that CMMC 2.0 is the 110 practices of NIST 800-171. So as you assess against NIST 800-171, which you should do, especially if you have CUI now, you're in effect assessing yourself against CMMC 2.0. So they're basically one and the same. But to that point, if you have CUI, you have these requirements now. There's the 7012 clause, and then there's a 7019 clause as well, and a 7020 clause that, but the 7012 says you need to assess yourself against NIST 800-171, which is 110 controls. There's also some cloud storage requirements and incident reporting and flow down requirements in that DFARS clause that you need to be aware of, especially if you are going to have data in the cloud. So just be aware that assessing yourself against NIST 800-171 is part of what you need to be doing to meet the 7012 clause. It's not all of it. You also need to, because of the 7019 clause, calculate your score, your assessment score against those 110 practices. Just to point out, one of those questions or one of those practices, the question is, do you have a system security plan? And if you can't answer yes, you have a system security plan, then the way the scoring is you can't calculate a score. It's NA. So a requirement is also that you have a system security plan. And along with that, you'll want to have an action plan to address practices that aren't in place. So calculate your score, be honest, and that there's a requirement to enter that score into the supplier performance risk system. This is a link to some information on how to do that here. There's also some slides in the backup that provide more detail on how to do that. And then there's a requirement to be available if DCMA decides to do a medium or high level assessment of your company. I don't know which companies they're picking, but DCMA could do require you to have an assessment in your organization through the department called the DIBCAC. And if they do, then they can come in and see your system. That's another requirement. But that's what you need to be doing now. This is a screenshot of that SPRS system. There's a lot of help information that's out there that's at those links. And again, like I said, there's some backup slide.
Oh, hey, Brian, we had a comment saying that there were the link in the PDF towards the previous webinars is broken. So
okay, yeah,
we'll take a look at that.
Yeah, when you're talking, I'll grab a link for the website and throw it in the chat. I apologize for that. I did that late last night at home, so there's no tell. I don't know where it went. But yeah, so I'll throw that in chat when we get when Eric is going through some slides. So go ahead.
I was going to say, so I was going to jump in here and talk a little bit about the model. First of all, just a reminder, if anybody has questions, please feel free to throw them out. We expect that we've got a mix of folks on the call today. Some people are probably very familiar with CMMC and really want to talk about some of the most recent rulings from the AB or from the DoD. And other people are probably just now hearing about this. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit on one thing that Brian said a couple of slides ago. The CMMC model came out first. There was version 1.0 that came out, a little bit like 2019 or so. They made a huge revision to that with version 2.0, which Brian was describing a little bit. And Brian mentioned that there's rulemaking going on, and that's true. But when we talk about rulemaking with CMMC, we're talking about more stuff on the contractual side. Some of the finer points that are going to be baked into the contract language, and some of the finer points about how the CMMC system is going to work. The main points about what do you need to do to meet the standard, those are locked in. And so you can start working towards that today. Hold on, it looks like we have okay, Brian, it looks like Brian put his, the link in the, somewhere in there. Okay, sorry
It's in
about
the
that.
chat.
So,
It's in the
okay,
chat. I can put it in well, it's in the chat. That's probably the best place.
okay. Uh, Thanks, Brian. So back to that point of, okay, what do I do right here, right now to get ready? What you see on the screen is an overview of the CMMC model. It is confusing, but it is structured this way in order to maintain historical compatibility with some previous cybersecurity regulations the DoD had for contractors. But the CMMC model basically says you need to implement 110 controls. And by the way, controls, that's in CMMC land, that is a synonym for requirements, for practices, for whatever. But it is 110 items that you need to implement in order to achieve your certification. That's when we talk about controls or requirements or whatever, that's what we're speaking to. Now, I do want to make one disclaimer right up front. You'll notice on the left, there are 3 levels defined for CMMC. Our assumption, based on what the DoD has said, is that we probably don't have anyone on the call that is pursuing level 3. I don't remember the exact number, but it's less than 1% of DoD firms are expected to need level 3. And odds are very good that if you are level 3, you already know it. You know who you are. These are companies that the government has basically pulled them aside and said, we believe that you are going to be purposefully targeted by a foreign nation in order to hack in and gain information. So when we throughout this conversation, we'll be talking about level 2 and level 1 because that is where the overwhelming majority of companies are supposed to fall, according to the DoD estimate. Like 99% of companies are supposed to be at level 2 and level 1. So regardless of which level you're at, CMMC divides all the practices or requirements into 14 domains. And the domains are just logical groupings. You can see a list of them in the blue box on the right. So all of the requirements surrounding, for instance, number 7, maintenance, all of the maintenance requirements, they get grouped into one domain. All of the training requirements, those are going to go into another domain. Within the domains, depending on which level of CMMC certification you're pursuing, it's almost like a catalog. And so the government has said, if you're pursuing level 1, you have these 17 requirements from these 6 domains. If you're pursuing level 2, you have all 110 requirements from all 14 domains. And again, I'm not going to go into it too much, but if you're pursuing level 3, there are actually additional requirements that come from a third document called NIST 800-172. But again, that's because the government thinks that what you're doing is so sensitive that you are definitely the exception. Like I said, you probably know who you are. But in any case, that's how the model is organized. Next slide. And again, if you've got questions, please feel free to jump out with them. All right. So that's how the model is organized. Let's talk about how you actually get your assessment, because let's be honest, that's what most people are interested in. Tell me what I got to do. Tell me how to do it. If you are at level 1, I've got good news for you. Level 1, we haven't really talked about this, but level 1 You can see down at the bottom, it says under the purple box level 1, there's a little blue box that says FCI. That means that you're handling federal contract information, and that's all you're handling. The good news is you've only got 17 requirements. And the even better news is you are allowed to assess yourself on these requirements. Now, that is a huge change from the first version of the model. CMMC 1.0, they said everyone has to have an independent assessment, no matter which level you're going for. Well, that was overkill for level 1, and the government admitted that. And so in version 2.0, which we're under now, the level 1 companies, which the DoD estimates is 70% of the industrial base, level 1s are allowed to do self-assessments. You don't need to hire anyone to come in and give you an independent evaluation. You can do it yourself. You have to do those self-assessments annually. And we'll talk about the assessment a little bit in a second. But basically, during the assessment, you're going to take an independent look at your security, look at the 17 requirements, and honestly evaluate yourself. Are we meeting this? Are we really doing this? Or are we not? We don't have it on this slide, but the DoD has put out an assessment guide that it's strongly encouraged that you use it when doing these assessments. And you can find that on the CMMC website. But yeah, you're going to look at your company's security and compare it to what those 17 requirements are asking. Hey, we're doing this, check. We're kind of coming up short here. We're not going to give ourselves credit. And the idea is that at the end of that process, and there's a scoring key, you will upload your results along with an affirmation from company leadership into that supplier performance risk system, which is run by the DoD. And that's it. You're good to go. So like I said, good news for level 1s. You don't have to go out and spend thousands of dollars on this independent assessment. Unfortunately, that good news doesn't extend to level 2. As Brian mentioned, everyone got their hopes up when version 2.0 of the model was announced, because as I said, when version 1.0 of the model, everyone had to have an independent assessment, no ifs, ands, or buts. Version 2.0, level 1's clear as could be. Level 1's can self-assess. There was a line in there that said that some level 2 companies would be allowed to self-assess, and so everyone got real excited, thinking, okay, I'm gonna get to save the 10,000 or however many dollars it's going to cost. The DoD has walked that back a little bit. They said this self-assessment at level 2, it only applies for companies that are not handling critical national security information. And by the way, if you're a DoD contractor, we can't envision a situation where a DoD contractor isn't handling critical national security information at the CUI level. I should have said this a minute ago, but at level 2, for those that are not familiar, the companies that need level 2 are the companies that are handling that controlled unclassified information, that CUI. We have a whole nother webinar that we do on figuring out which level you're at. If you're uncertain what CUI is, if you're not familiar with that term, look around your workplace. If you have information that's labeled FOUO or SBU, sensitive but unclassified, or law enforcement sensitive, or anything like that, really, if you have information in your company's possession that you can't release to the public, there's a good chance that you have CUI, and therefore you need to take a careful look at it, and there's a really good chance that you're going to need level 2. So yeah, to boil it down, if you have that CUI, or you think you have CUI, you need to go ahead and assume that you will need a third-party assessor to do your assessment. Um, better to prepare for it and then find out later that you can self-assess than the other way around. So next slide. All right, so I've touched on this a little bit already. I have a bad habit of getting ahead of my slides, but um, as we talked about, if you have CUI, you are at level 2. That is a guarantee. That is the definition of level 2. Is if you have CUI, you need level 2. If you don't have CUI, again, level 1 is for you. And good news, you can do the self-assessment. All right, so there's a question: how will my organization know what CMMC 2.0 level is required for a contract? So the answer is, once CMMC 2.0 is implemented, it will show up in the request for information, which CMMC level you need. They're going to spell it out up front. Before you go to propose on it, you're going to see whether or not you have to be level 2 certified or level 1 certified in order to bid and be awarded the contract. They have said that you've got to have your certification in place before contract award. So if you don't have your level 2 certification quite finished, but there's a thing you want to bid on and your independent assessor is coming next week, you can probably go ahead and do that. But it is a hard and fast rule that your certification needs to be awarded by the time that the contract is ready to be awarded. And then a popular question that we see a lot: will primes and subs be required to maintain the same level? It's easy to imagine that maybe you're a sub to Northrop or Lockheed or BAE or one of these giant companies. They are level 3 because they handle some really sensitive stuff. They know they're level 3. They're going after a contract that's level 3. But you, the sub, you do a very small piece of this project. Do you also have to be level 3, or can it be a different, can you, because you're handling less sensitive data, can you get by on a lower level? And the answer is, it depends on the data. I have a saying that I'm really fond of, and that is that these requirements follow the data. So if the data you're handling as a subcontractor is super sensitive level 3 data, then you're going to have to be level 3. If the data that you're handling from your prime contractor is level 2 or level 1 data, even though your prime contractor is level 3, in theory, you should be able to be level 2 or level 1. Now then, what has not been spelled out is how this is going to actually work. Like, what are the mechanics of this going to look like? That is still a big question in my mind, and they haven't, that I'm aware of, they have not really addressed it yet. I will also say that it is really easy for me to imagine a scenario, because we've kind of already seen this, where prime contractors say, we don't have time to figure this out. We have to be level 3, therefore everybody else has to be level 3 too. There's a lot of things that could happen, a lot of things still to be spelled out. But in theory, you and your prime don't have to be the same level certified. It's going to depend on the data that you're handling. Next slide. All right. So I've talked about the assessment a little bit. Let's talk about how to get ready for the assessment in more detail. Our recommended workflow looks something like this, and we, at the risk of getting ahead of Brian's slides, we are available to help you with parts of this through a grant by the DoD. But this is our recommended workflow for your system. Step 1, determine your scope. I'll talk about that in a second. Step 2, conduct a self-assessment. I talked about that a little bit earlier. That's where you sit down with the requirements and you take a hard look at what you're doing. Are we doing this? Yeah, we're doing this, or no, not really. take a hard look at it and make those tough calls. Number three, where you are coming up short, develop an action plan to fix those weaknesses. Number four, develop your system security plan. Brian talked about that a little bit, but I'll cover it in more detail as well. And then number five, create system or security documents. I'll talk about what I mean by that in a second. So next slide. All right, number one, and this is maybe, in my opinion, this is maybe the most important part of the assessment. I mean, the most important part is figuring out what kind of data do you have. So that's step one. Do I only have federal contract information, FCI, or do I have that CUI, that controlled unclassified information? Once you answer that question, I think the second most important question is what is my scope? And the reason for that is this. That first bullet point, the scope defines the equipment that's being assessed or evaluated against CMMC. So oftentimes, I'll be honest, implementing CMMC in your company is going to take time, and it's probably going to wind up costing you money, not just time, but money also. And every computer that you have to implement CMMC on, every network hardware that you have to implement CMMC on, every person you need to train on CMMC, that's just going to drive up those requirements of time and money. So you want to make the smallest network that you can when you're assessing your scope. So in other words, what I mean by that is you want to try and design your network or networks so that when you evaluate your CMMC status, you are only looking at a very small number of computers, employees, and network equipment. What you really want to be able to do is say, okay, I'll use UAH as an example. We have a giant network, and it is full of all kinds of unsavory characters, both employees and students. If we handle CUI, we don't want to be in a position of having to apply CMMC level 2 to the entire UAH network. That would be a nightmare. That would be a nightmare of nightmares. Instead, if we have to handle CUI, I want to do something to make that problem much more manageable. I want to create a separate network that is only maybe 10 computers, that only 15 people have access to, that no one can get into from the internet or from the rest of the UAH network. Once I've done that, that is my scope. And I'm going to declare everything else out of bounds. I'm going to declare it out of scope. And that allows me to make the big problem much more manageable. So now I will say, I don't have it on this slide. We have another webinar where we talk in more detail about scoping your network. But when it comes to scoping your network, in order to claim that something is out of scope or out of bounds, as I like to call it, you have to show that there's a separation between your CUI network and the rest of your network. You can do it with firewalls. You can do it with VLANs. If you physically separate the network, that's even better. But you've got to show that there's some kind of separation. You can't just make something out of bounds because you want to. But anyway, I've kind of the blue boxes in the middle. I've kind of touched on number one quite a bit. Within the scope of what you're going to assess, there are 5 general classes of equipment. Number one, out of scope. I've beat that horse to death. Number 2, specialized assets. Those number 2 and 3. And by the way, the DoD has put out a scoping document that gives you very good concrete guidance on how to decide if something's out of scope or not. But number 2 and 3, they don't have to be evaluated against the entire CMMC model. Specialized assets are things like Internet of Things devices, a smart TV, or something like that. As a cyber guy, I'd probably ask, why do you have your smart TV on your CUI network? But whatever, maybe there's a need for it to be there. That would be an example of a specialized asset that you don't have to implement all of CMMC on. Government equipment is the most common. If you have a government laptop, you're kind of limited in what you can do. You can't go and change out the antivirus and other stuff. The government won't let you. Those are examples of specialized assets. Contractor risk managed assets are computers and other equipment on the CUI network that might have CUI, but aren't supposed to. They don't ordinarily handle CUI. Technically speaking, you don't have to implement the entire CMMC model against contractor risk managed assets. Instead, you are allowed as the contractor to manage that risk in the way that makes sense to you. You're allowed to apply your own policies and procedures and things like that. I will tell you that when your assessment happens, the assessor has been trained to ask questions about contractor risk managed assets, because those are computers on the CUI network. And if you don't seem like you have a good plan for those systems, your assessment could go poorly. So I would be very careful in declaring something to be a risk managed asset. And if you do declare something to be a risk managed asset, I would have really good policies and procedures and security on those assets. Number 4, security protection. These are devices like firewalls and intrusion detection that are protecting the network. You have to implement all of CMMC against that 4th class. And then number 5, CUI assets. This is equipment that is used to store, process, and transmit CUI. You have to implement the entire CMMC model against that 5th class as well. So I know scoping is not the most exciting topic. Hopefully a few of you are still awake at this point. To me, I think it's so crucial. So I apologize if I belabored these points too long or too much, but I just think that they're really important. Next slide.
Before we move on, I did want to point out that there's a link that's supposed to work that goes to the site where you can download the scoping guide. Also, that's where you can get assessment guides as well that we'll refer to in a moment. The table in the middle is a good summary, and it's part of that guide that just as a quick look at what we've talked about for each of the classes of assets or categories of assets and how they relate to your assessment.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so the second part of our process that we recommend, do that self-assessment. I've talked about this a little bit. As I said, there are 110 controls or requirements. Go through, take a hard look at all 110. Is my company doing this? We recommend that you use that DoD assessment guide that the DoD puts out. Now, I want to stop on that last high-level bullet point. Answer every question with the process, tool, or practice in place, not just a yes or no. Those sub-bullets are actually pretty important. When your independent assessor comes in, they've been trained to try and get a handle on where's the proof that you're doing this. It's not just a yes or no question. The DCMA, as Brian mentioned earlier, they are currently doing CMMC assessments of C3PAOs. And when the DCMA comes in to assess these independent assessors, they are asking for 2 pieces of evidence out of that bottom list. So they are looking to interview employees. They are looking to examine configuration or logs or records, or they are looking to test using a tool or some kind of network probe or something like that. And in order for DCMA, now this is the government, But in order for DCMA to say, yes, you're meeting this control, they want to be able to say yes to at least two of those three things. So they want to see a test and an interview, or they want to see an interview along with records they can examine, but they want to see two out of those three. So when you're going through doing your self-assessment, we recommend that you grade yourself the same way that DCMA or your C3PAO would. Next slide. All right. So after you've looked at all 110 controls, it's highly unlikely. If you come back with 110 with a perfect score, I would encourage you to go back and take a second look, because it's, especially on the first pass through, odds are good that you're going to have something that you are not meeting the standard. For everything where you're coming up short, and it's okay because everybody is going to have controls they're not meeting, you need to create an action plan. And that's also called a POAM, a plan of action and milestones. Couple quick notes, because there are changes between version 1.0 of the model and version 2.0 of the model. On version 1, you weren't allowed to have POAMs. By the time the independent assessor came in, you had to be perfect, or else you weren't going to get certified. That has changed a little bit. Now, CMMC 2.0 is going to allow POAMs at contract award, but there are practices that you can't say, yeah, we'll get to it later. You can't put them on the POAM. And then DoD is going to establish a minimum score. For every practice, there are points that you either get or lose depending on whether you're meeting them. The highest possible score is 110. I don't know what the lowest possible score is, but it's negative. I mean, I've seen people get down in the negative, 100 plus, 200 plus, 300 plus. So negative scores are possible and are common in my experience. But in any case, that's how this works. Create that action plan, also called a POAM. You're just going to basically describe how you're going to fix it. We have discovered this weakness. Here's our plan to fix it. Here's who is assigned to fix it. Here are the resources they need. Here is the due date. It doesn't have to be, hugely detailed, but you need to make some general notes. Next slide.
Just to add real quick, when we talked about what is required now, I probably didn't. I don't think I mentioned this, but one of the requirements that, in addition to your scores, you have to enter the date that your score will be 110. So it's a plan like this that you generate where you assign responsibilities and assign reasonable dates for these practices to be, or these practices or controls to be in place. And that the largest date on this list is the date that you expect to have everything implemented, meaning the furthest out date. So that would be the date that you would want to enter into the SPR system as an indicator of when you think you'll be at 110.
Brian, we had a question come in, and you might know the answer to this because I don't. Has the DoD set a new due date for CMMC compliance needs to be met again?
Yeah, so the only dates that we know are back from November 4th. They said it'll be 9 to 24 months before the rulemaking will be in place. So 9 months from then would be the soonest we might expect to see rulemaking. And what that means is they will come out with a set of rules, DFARS clauses, I believe, that will state what the requirements will be for CMMC. It will say, more than likely, things that we've talked about, that the RFP should say what level of CMMC is required. And then the we would expect information like answers to these questions. What are the highest weighted practices that must be in place, that cannot be on the POAM list? What is the minimum score that you can have before you can be considered certified? So we don't know the dates, and but when those rules come out, that just means those clauses can start going on to RFPs, which will mean before you can implement them, you would have to have had, the certifications and everything completed and have your scores entered into the system. So I hope that answers the question. To answer the questions, we don't know, but it'll be 9 to 24 months from November, early November.
Clear as mud, right? Next slide. Okay. So after you've got your gaps, we recommend that you develop what's called a system security plan. Now, Brian mentioned earlier, this is also called an SSP. There's one or two requirements within SPRS that you have to do, or else you can't enter a score. It won't let you. And this is one of them. You've got to document a system security plan. Now, you can see kind of the example there in the box. In addition to the bullet points over on the left are kind of the high level thing, describe ownership, responsibilities, who owns the data, what kind of users, who are the users, the privileged users, where's the system operating, all that high level stuff. You definitely want to capture that in your system security plan. And then our recommendation, and we're basing this on the template that was put out by NIST. For those that aren't familiar, and there's been a ton of acronyms thrown out during this presentation, but for those that aren't familiar, NIST is a part of the federal government that is responsible for cybersecurity of unclassified systems. They wrote NIST 800-171, which is where the 110 requirements you have to implement, that's where those came from. So NIST also put out a template for this document, the system security plan, and we've kind of adapted that template into what you see on the screen. But basically, for every single requirement, you want to describe what you're doing to meet that requirement. You said you're doing it. Okay, please describe what you're doing. If you're not meeting it, please describe what you're going to do to get better. And then finally, and I think this is a really important part that I've seen a lot of companies overlook, describe what you're doing and where do I find the proof? Okay, you say you're doing that. Where do I go and find the evidence to verify that? We call that a reference, but that's what it is where do I find the proof? You say you're doing it, show me. That's what that is. Next slide. All right, and then finally, the really boring part, which it's not like the first 4 steps are the most exciting in the world, but the really boring part, and yet the really crucial part is create system documents. Let me boil it down like this. There are going to be many controls out of those 110 where you tell your assessor, you tell the government, we're meeting this control because our people know how to behave. Our people know what they're supposed to do. They know what they can do. They know what they can't do. And they're going to say, okay, how do your employees know what to do? And you're going to say, well, look, it's in my policy. And then I train them on my policy. And here are my records showing I trained them on my policy. This whole process, CMMC, is inspired and based on the risk management framework process that the government uses on their systems. And if you have exposure to RMF, you know that policy is a huge deal there. And it's a huge deal here too. The documentation requirements are lower than they used to be, but you definitely still want to have policies and procedures that describe your security. And we recommend, breaking them up by domain, have a training policy and training procedures, have a maintenance policy and maintenance procedures. And you want to capture all of the rules and all of the steps. I mean, you want to be detailed. Everyone here is probably familiar with policy and procedures, so I'm again beating a dead horse. But in any case, that's the last step. It's easy to overlook it, but I really think it's crucial. Brian, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, something that we found that's helpful when we're assisting organizations in our guided self-assessments is if they have policies and procedures that they reference the portion of the NIST standard or the CMMC standard that step of the procedure or that procedure itself is meeting. This is for two reasons. One is it's helpful for when you ultimately have the third-party assessor to be able to answer that. Well, where do I go? Prove it to me. Show me where you have a procedure that says this is how you're going to configure your new systems that you put on your CUI network. Well, here's where it is. But also for yourself is that if you can't put a check mark by a procedure or a policy, or I'm going to say procedure primarily, that addresses a certain practice, then you may have a gap. So doing that cross-reference is critical. The other thing we recommend, and this is just based on our experience, is recommend that in every procedure you identify the forms, tools, training materials that are going to be referenced. If you're going to create a log, identify where those logs are going to be maintained. When I say a log, maybe a log or a log of some training that was completed. Be able to identify those things associated with each of the procedures. And again, that builds that process and those procedures into your operating system, your day-to-day operating system, and it won't be something that you don't look at for a year. So that's just some of the recommendations that we have. Another thing too is as you build your procedures, there's certain things that you put into your system that only the system administrator or only those that are dealing with security functions ever have to worry about or know about. So it may be a good idea you can structure your procedures that way, where here's the systems, here's the security functions, and here's the practices that they address. Here's what users need to know about. Like users don't necessarily need to know how to set up a user account or how to assign roles and functions. But a manager may need to know how to request that a user be set up, and a user may need to know I'm not supposed to go use somebody else's username or password. So just break up your practices into the roles and functions of people. That'll help you not just have a large, massive document that you have to read through the whole thing to find out what do I need to know, but break it up into where the individual roles and responsibilities understand what their requirement is for that particular procedure or groups of procedures.